Hello and welcome back to George Past the Post. This video is going to look back at the 2015 UK general election, which was held just over 10 years ago in May 2015. Hence, it's the 2015 election. Now, the election is worth looking back at, not only because of the many consequences, but it's interesting in its own right from a voting system nerd perspective. And also, did you know that the 2015 election is the only election ever, I believe, that was held on a fixed term election date, thanks to our departed friend, the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So let me just explain this very exciting point. So under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it basically said that the next election would be held first Thursday of May, 5 years after the previous election. So as the previous election was held in May 2010, that meant it would be held in May 2015. In 2017, the election was called early because 2/3 of MPs voted for an early election, which was under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And in 2019, to get around that very provision, Parliament actually passed a new law, which basically said, we are going to pretend that the Fixed Term Parliament Act doesn't exist. We're passing a new law to basically say the election would be held on December 2019. And of course, after 2019, the Fixed Term Parliament Act was, of course, repealed. So before we even get started, the 2015 election date is itself unique. The only election date to be held basically when the Fixed Term Parliament Act wanted it to be, and one of only two elections to be effectively where the date was set in legislation. So it said when the 2015 election would be, and the 2019 early election act to circumvent the Fixed Term Parliament Act did also have in the bill, it said that the election date would be there. So that's before we even get into the exciting details of the 2015 election. But there is method to this madness. So the reason I bring up, let's look at the Fixed Term Parliament Act and why it was even brought in. Well, of course, there were very principled arguments in favour of having a fixed term parliament to take the power away from the Prime Minister to decide when the election would be. Elections are arguably, they're easier to run if everyone knows when the election date will be. But it's good to have a couple of, it's still provisions in there in case you had to have an election called earlier. But who brought in this act? Well, after the 2010 election, we had the coalition government formed between the Conservatives, led by David Cameron, anyone remember him? And the Liberal Democrats, led by Nick Clegg, does anyone remember him? In the election in 2010, Gordon Brown was the Labour leader, anyone remember him? To be balanced, I'm basically now going to have to say that any politician I mentioned, I'm going to say, do you remember them? So, as I say, there were very principled arguments in favour of having a fixed term parliament. If you're being slightly cynical, and I'm sure both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats would deny this, the Fixed Term Parliament Act, by basically saying that the 2010 to 2015 Parliament is going to be 5 years, and by saying that the Prime Minister could no longer call the election, it arguably ensured that it made it harder for either the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats to pull the plug. So David Cameron couldn't have just gone to the palace and said, I'm going to call an election, and it made it harder for the Lib Dems to pull the plug as well. Oh, how cynical of me. But back to the 2015 election result itself. It shows the many random nature, I suppose, the many random natures, that's not a phrase anyway, of first past the post. So, unexpectedly, as in no opinion poll predicted, not even the famous exit poll predicted that the Conservatives would win a small majority of around 10 seats. We won't get into the technicalities. It was a little bit higher when you factor in Sinn Féin MPs don't take their seats, and then there are 4 MPs, the Speaker, and 3 deputies that don't vote. Anyway, the Conservative vote share went up by about 0.6%, something like that. The Labour Party, their number of seats dropped significantly because they lost all but one of their seats in Scotland, and they lost several marginals to the Conservatives. But perversely, their vote share went up by more than the Conservatives nationally. So that's first past the post. And that's before we even get to the fact the SNP, they got 50% of the vote in Scotland and won almost all the seats, 56 of 59. UKIP got about 13% of the vote nationally, but they got 1 MP. Constituency was Clacton. I wonder who the MP for Clacton is now. What is his name? I have no idea. So they got just 1 MP. Meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats, who they did collapse from 57 seats to 8, they only got 8% of the vote, yet they got 8 seats, which is still more than UKIP. So just based on the results themselves, it shows the nature of first past the post. And now we get to some of the consequences caused, I would argue, by first past the post, by the result itself. So because the Conservatives had a majority, that of course led to the 2016 referendum on EU membership, which of course resulted in the vote to leave. And then of course David Cameron resigned and Theresa May became Prime Minister. And I would argue the specific nature of the Conservative majority, so the size of the majority. So I think whatever their majority had been, there would have been a referendum. But because it was a small majority, that was one of the key factors that I think then caused Theresa May to call the 2017 election. Now, of course, there are 2 other pretty big reasons. One, she had a 20-point poll lead, and 2, she wanted another sort of Brexit mandate, a mandate to get her own version of Brexit through the House of Commons, perhaps seeing, as turned out in 2019, that either a hung parliament or one with a small majority might lead to problems later down the road. But thirdly, I just think in general, so aside from Brexit or even the 20-point poll lead, governing with a small majority is hard, especially when you're a new Prime Minister. And I do recall in 2017, around the time of the budget, there were about 5 or 6 bits of it had to be at least redrafted or amended because there are about 5 or 6 Tory MPs that were unhappy with various provisions. And of course, when you have a majority of just 10 or 12, you only need 5 or 6 MPs to cause trouble. Had the Conservative majority been a little bigger from 2015, and of course the first past the post, because so many seats are so close, it's possible they could have got a bigger majority. Maybe Theresa May doesn't call the election 2017. And then we're in the very interesting world where perhaps Theresa May does get a form of Brexit through in 2019. And back to our old friend, the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Under that act, of course, the next election would have been in 2020. You might recall something called COVID happened in 2020. And so we could have then had the 2020 election postponed by a year, possibly, which, another fascinating point, would have put the House of Lords centre stage, because one of the areas that the House of Lords still have an absolute veto on is the extension of the life of Parliament. And of course, what would have happened if we'd got to 2021, the general election 2021? What would have happened between Conservatives, led by Theresa May, Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, and UKIP, led by, what was his name? Nigel Farage, of course. because even with Brexit having been done, perhaps there would have been still contention. Farage would have perhaps said that it wasn't a pure form of Brexit, and therefore, he would have used that to campaign. There's another scenario, of course, which is going back to 2015. If the Conservatives had done less well, and if we'd either had just a Conservative minority government, or even an Ed Miliband-led government of some form, if the results have been slightly different, we may not have had the referendum at all, or we would have perhaps had it, but later on, not in 2016. So what would the result of the referendum have been had it been held a year later, 2 years later? And of course, in a scenario where it's either a Conservative minority or Labour minority, we possibly don't get Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. Because if it's a Conservative minority, maybe that would mean there would be the prospect of maybe another election quite soon, despite the things of the Parliament Act. So perhaps Labour decide, well, we're not going to have a leadership election. We're going to either Ed Miliband stays on, or we're going to have an acting leader who will act as leader until the next election, which could have been maybe 2016. And of course, the Labour minority government may not have lasted that long, because you would have needed the SNP, basically all the non-Conservative parties to all align. A bit like a hypothetical, what if in 2010 Nick Clegg had gone in with Labour, it would have resulted in a very fragmented coalition. Not impossible, but my point is that because it was so fractious, it may have been difficult to last. And so that's why I say the referendum may have been delayed rather than just never have happened, because perhaps we have to have another election in 2016. And then, whoever the Conservative leader might be, maybe Theresa May, Boris Johnson, I suspect they would have still kept the pledge of having a referendum in the manifesto. And on top of all of this, obviously the 2015 referendum leads to the Brexit referendum. That in itself it shook up British politics, and we're still seeing the effects today. It unmoored people's political allegiances. People who perhaps had always thought of themselves as being Conservative voters became open to not voting Conservative anymore, and perhaps people who had always voted Labour suddenly, because of the Brexit issue, maybe ended up voting Conservative in 2019. But those are discussions for perhaps another video to do with the referendum itself. So my point, 13 minutes in, is to basically say that the 2015 election shows how important the voting systems are, because of first past the post, the history of the UK, the history and the trajectory of the country was affected by a few hundred votes in a few key constituencies in 2015. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.